Look, there's a top filmmaker looking at us absolutely aghast, wondering what on earth he's got himself involved with. And that filmmaker is David Leaf, who is now offering us the US versus John Lennon. Hello, David.
Hello, great to be here.
How are you?
I'm terrific.
This is Mark Kermode. He's dressed as Shakin' Stevens, but he is our film critic.
I like Shakin' Stevens.
What, this old house?
No, Shakin' Stevens was very good as the young Elvis in Elvis the Musical.
I'm just guessing David Leaf doesn't know who Shakin' Stevens is.
No, I know the name, but he didn't make an impression in the States.
That's not really surprising. Well, now, the disadvantage of that is that you've seen the US versus John Lennon.
Yes.
But I'm going to get David to describe it first of all. David, thanks for coming in, by the way.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
So, the US versus John Lennon, just explain how old this idea is. How long have you been working on this project?
The idea came to us in the mid to late 90s after the FBI documents had finally been released. And we were able to see the smoking guns in the story and understand exactly how and why the Nixon administration and J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI had targeted John Lennon because he was perceived to be a threat for the 1972 Nixon re-election campaign.
Now I imagine there'll be a whole number of listeners who are right up to speed with this and know exactly what you're talking about. And she's right, I know the story that you're going to tell us, but I'm interested to hear what you found. And then there'll be another lot of listeners will be thinking, well, John Lennon, he was in the Beatles and did Imagine, and he got killed, and they don't know anything else. So this is a story which is sort of underreported, isn't it?
For the most part, it's a story that has come out in bits and pieces, and the film really connects all the dots. And what you said is exactly true for people under 40, especially for people under 30, for whom John Lennon is he might as well be Winston Churchill in terms of what young people know about him. And so this is the movie that, 26 years ago today, Lennon was murdered. So why every year on this anniversary are mums and dads all teary-eyed when they think about John Lennon? This is a movie that explains to younger people why John Lennon mattered, other than the fact that he was in the Beatles. Okay,
so set up the scene then with... This is sort of post-Beatles, most of this film.
Most of it is. In 1969, John and Yoko get married, and they embark on a campaign for peace. At that point in time, they are probably, with the exception maybe of Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, the most famous couple in the world. The Beatles are still together. The Beatles are the most famous group in the world, and John Lennon is the leader of the Beatles, is somebody who attracts a crowd wherever he goes. And what John and Yoko decide to do is use this spotlight they have, not to promote a record, not to promote themselves even, but to promote peace. And we're in the middle of the Vietnam War, a war that was going very, very badly. There was a big anti-war movement, a lot of people getting killed. And John, who by all accounts was a pretty angry, rebellious, anti-establishment person, and a violent, he was a street fighter. I mean, a teddy boy 50 years ago, or at least dressed like a Ted.
Don't hear you saying that he looked like Shakin' Stevens, though, Simon.
No. Do you know why? He never did. I think it would also be extremely disrespectful.
Anyway, John and Yoko started campaigning for peace, and they ended up in the crosshairs of the Nixon administration when they came to America, because they were aligned with the radical left there, who were perceived as revolutionaries.
Okay, the radical left comprising who?
Well, there were the yippies, who were kind of the almost the clown princes of the radical left, and then there were the black.
Could you just explain who the yippies were? Then?
Abby Hoffman, Jerry Rubin. They were radical agitators who had seized upon. I mean, the radical left had seized upon the Vietnam War as the cause to focus all of their anger at the American establishment around. The Black Panthers were part of the radical left. There was a Chicano group. The women's movement was just starting.
So how would John and Yoko hooked up with these extremists? Well, by American political terms, extremists.
They were absolutely extremists. When John and Yoko arrived in America in mid to late 1971, the radical left was pretty spent at that point in time, and they saw an opportunity, if they could enlist John and use his celebrity to revitalize the movement. And John and Yoko went and played at a concert for an activist by the name of John Sinclair, who was a great character. I don't know if you've ever seen the television show Taxi. There was a guy named Jim.
Sure, yeah, many years ago, yeah.
I don't know if you remember Jim Ignatowski, Iggy they called him, and he was an absolute stoner. John Sinclair comes across as that kind of guy, a guy who's lit up more blunts than there are in a cigarette machine. I mean, just an amazingly funny guy, and has a great perspective on it. At the time, however, he was proselytizing for marijuana reform, got busted for having 2 joints, and was sentenced to prison for 10 years. And John and Yoko were persuaded to come and headline a benefit concert that was designed to focus attention on that case. What they didn't know was that the presence of all these other radical left activists at the concert would attract the FBI. And when John and Yoko performed some songs with some very pointed lyrics, the FBI wrote down the lyrics and began a very active file and then surveillance of John, because the concert was so successful that Sinclair was let out of jail within 48 hours of the concert. And so the decision was made, or the discussion became, well, John, if you can have this much of an effect with just playing one show, what if you do a whole tour of the United States and do an anti-war tour, essentially an anti-Nixon tour? And when that intelligence reached the highest levels of American government, they were quite terrified, because in 1972 it was the first year that 18-year-olds had the right to vote, which meant somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 million first-time voters, all of them Beatle fans, were going to be voting. And they were terrified at the prospect of John saying, don't vote for Nixon, vote for the other guy. Now, if they had looked at the Billboard charts and seen John's record sales, maybe they wouldn't have been quite so concerned. But
he wasn't at the height of his creative powers.
He was in a different place. He was creating performance art with Yoko, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. And of course, he had a number of hits like "Power to the People" and "Imagine" in America. But clearly, his all-time best work, his best Beatles work was behind him.
But the authorities actually believed that John Lennon was a political danger to them.
Absolutely. They thought that he could sway young people to vote against Nixon. And the paranoia of the Nixon administration, the absolute criminality of the Nixon administration, many of the figures in the administration went to jail. So you had this situation where guys who were breaking the law were looking at somebody who was just honestly expressing how he felt, and that was a danger to them.
My girlfriend is from China. To her, Mark is known as strange loud man from Wadio. This is absolutely true, he says. Actually, to be perfectly honest, Peter, that's how Mark is known in a lot of homes, it has to be said.
Including his own.
Joe Lynn. My name is Joe. I'm in Chicago, listening via the BBC stream on the internet. Your programme always makes my morning pass quickly. I'd like Mark to know that his "Are we laughing at cultural ignorance or participating in it by watching Borat analysis" has jumped the Atlantic. I've read 2 articles in the past week where the writers were questioning Borat's popularity, much in the way The Good Doctor has done since the very beginning.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, it was a couple of weeks later that that piece appeared by Joe Queenan, which was saying almost exactly the same thing, which was, what's so funny about snot-nosed English Cambridge graduates laughing at, allegedly thick Americans. I do, as I said, I think there is a rampant strain of anti-Americanism in that film, and I think we find it very easy to sneer from here, and I think that's a very bad thing.
Have you seen Borat, David?
I have.
What do you think?
Well, I laughed. I mean, and I don't remember the last time I heard an audience in a theater laugh that hard. I mean,
where did you see it?
In Los Angeles, in Santa Monica. And the difference is, and I think it's generational, is it's clearly a mean-spirited movie, but it's very, very funny.
I mean, I think my problem is I would have forgiven it more were it funnier. I sat in a room with people who were just laughing themselves silly, and the more they laughed, the more I thought, I have arrived here from another planet, and I really don't understand this.
True.
No, but it's funny because there is a point at which laughter would have somehow commuted it for me, but I just didn't think it was anything like hard-hitting enough. Anyway, sorry.
Just one other point on that, David. Last week we were speaking to a British comedian, Jimmy Carr, and...
sorry.
Is that Borat himself?
Mark?
Sorry.
Clearly the call is more important than being part of the program.
I was turning it off. I wasn't taking it. I was turning it off.
Right. Thank you very much. I apologise for Shaky here. He's
I'm really sorry. That's never happened to me before.
It's the cough syrup.
Okay, Jimmy Carr, the comedian, said that when he went to see it in Leeds, he said it was quite an interesting line. He said there were like two laughter tracks running. One, people who got the fact that he was Jewish, and so he was making a joke about people who were racist and anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
And there was a whole lot of other people who were just laughing because they found the anti-Semitic jokes funny. Was that true when you saw it in Los Angeles, do you think, or not?
I wasn't looking at it from that point of view, really. It was. I think the audience knew it was a joke. I mean, it's the west side of Los Angeles. It's probably one of the largest percentage of Jewish populations in America outside of New York. I mean, when he said, let's all go back to New York, there are no Jews there, I mean, there was a big knowing laugh.
Okay. Mark, what do you make of the US versus John Lennon?
Well, it's very interesting. This subject is endlessly interesting to me for two reasons. I've always been very sceptical about Lennon. I always found it very hard to take seriously somebody, who sang Imagine No Possessions in the middle of the biggest living room I've ever seen in my life. And I think there was an awful lot of what Lennon did that was legitimately open to mockery. That said, I also think that Richard Nixon was the devil. I mean, famously, when I was young, my dad sat me down in front of the television and pointed to Nixon and said, "You see that? That is the devil." So I genuinely did think he was. And
when you say famously, maybe in your house?
In my house, yes.
Yeah. No, but not to anyone else.
No, but I have mentioned it before, so yes. I didn't want to. So
it kind of doesn't make it famous, though.
Okay.
It's not like a famous quote.
Thank you.
In a book of quotations, it's not going to be there, is it?
Is it going to be like this for the rest of the programme?
It's famous now, though, because you mentioned it on your show.
So. Thank you.
Yeah, that's very true. Looking forward to our Christmas lunch.
It would take somebody like Nixon and like the FBI to take Lennon as seriously as they did. Now, the interesting thing about it is because there's an awful lot written about Lennon's, alleged persecution, actually, as it turns out in the documentary, quite genuine persecution by the authorities during this period. The Nixon administration was so paranoid, they did consider absolutely everybody to be a threat. The FBI thinking that pop groups were a threat dates way back to the days of Louie Louie, and, we know all about the investigations into that sort of thing. What gives this a particular edge is the fact that you've done it now, because actually there are very uneasy echoes with the situation in America now in relation to the Iraq War, because what everyone said about Iraq is it's going to become the new Vietnam. And although that's a gross simplification, the issues surrounding people speaking out against Iraq are strikingly similar to the issues which the documentary deals with. So although I do have a problem with taking Lennon entirely seriously, and I don't think that Lennon was ever the threat that either the authorities or he himself perceived himself to be, I think that what the documentary does is raise an issue that is still very, very present. And that was surprising to me, because in the past I've tended to read things like, for example, that fantastic book by Fenton Bresler, Who Killed John Lennon, which alleges ludicrously that, it was a Manchurian candidate and all that, so which is all absolute nonsense, because clearly after the early 70s, the authorities gave up finding him threatening, because, once the Nixon thing had gone, they realised that he was what he was, which was a perfectly peaceable hippie. He wasn't really going to do anybody any harm, and as you said correctly, his best work was behind him. But there was an insane period in which they genuinely did think that he was dangerous to them. But Nixon thought that everybody was dangerous to him.
Well, John did give a lot of money to radical left causes.
No, that's true. Yep.
And even though when he gave money to the Black Panthers, he said, I want you to use this for your breakfast program. But who knows what happens when you give money to a radical group? Are they using it for guns, or are they using it for butter?
When you talk about destruction, don't you know you can count me out?
Count me in, out. That's the interesting thing, isn't it? What he says is, you can count me out, in. He says both of them. It's this. I'm not making this up. He says, you can.
In my famous version, he says.
No, in the version on the record, and I invite listeners to email us in. He says, you can count me out, and then there's a pause, and then he says in, because he was undecided.
Well, David Leaf, you're going to have to officiate.
Am I correct about that?
Well, he's correct, except the in wasn't as strong as the out, even though there was ambivalence expressed, but clearly in everything else he said about violence, he was opposed to violent destruction, violent revolution.
But just on a point-scoring basis, I was correct.
Well, compared to him.
Thank you. Exactly.
And on Christmas Day, you can play both versions and figure that out. He's not happy.
You carry on. That's fine.
Okay.
There is a version where he definitely echoes the out with in.
And which is that version?
That's the proper version that was released to the world.
Well, there were two. There actually
two versions.
There was an album version and a single version, and I'm not an anorak. I can't remember.
You're in the wrong place. Should be said as well, there is an awful lot of that that stuff in the documentary, the much lighter stuff, for example, the bed-ins, the baggism stuff, the announcement of the state of Newtopia, all of which is best seen as prankster-ish. I mean, he thinks it's funny. I mean, I think there may be a serious one, but it's a joke. You either get it or you don't, right?
Well, it's his sense of humor throughout that I mean, it was always what made him one of the most charismatic people on the planet, was there was a self-deprecation to the wit and, I mean, charming and immense charisma that he had. But if you remember when he returned his MBE, he announced why he was returning it, and it was protesting this and protesting that, and then it was protesting that his latest single was slipping off the charts. So he was always making fun of himself at the same time he was doing it. He was willing to be the butt of the joke if he could get his message out there.
On the out-in debate,
here we go.
This from the Waldies, who says, on the more famous fast version of Revolution, Lennon sings Count Me Out. On the slow, more acoustic version, he sings Count Me Out and sings In softly afterwards. The version I'm talking about is the B-side, which is on the single, okay, which is the one that gets played. Michael Fisher, Anorak, says, Mark and Simon are both right. On the single version of Revolution, you only get out. On the White Album, you get out and in.
You're really glad you came now, aren't you?
Well, absolutely.
It's like this every week, David. That's the fun of it.
I'll be back.
And on Christmas Day. Anyway, David, thanks very much indeed for coming in. Wish you all the best for the US versus John Lennon.
Thank you. Thank you for the time.